This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
My talk is called Avalokitesvara's Tears. Had I the heavens embroidered cloths, enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. I think that one of the things that makes getting ordained such a significant act is that in doing so, we throw in our lot with each other. And of all that we throw in, it is our dreams that are the most potent and the most tender. In getting ordained, we spread our dreams under each other's feet. So maybe that's why it was this poem that came into my mind first when I started to think about this talk. No doubt also because in reflecting on and talking about our history, I'm aware that I might well tread on your dreams, yours as well as mine. Aware that, like the poet W.B. Yeats, our dreams are perhaps all that we feel we have to offer, though what we would offer, if we could, are the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light. So I will try to tread softly on the dreams that we have spread under each other's feet. What immediately came after the image and sensibility of the cloths of heaven was that scene from the first chapter of the Vimalakirti Nirdesa, where the Buddha magically causes all the parasols of the 500 Lichavi youths to become one canopy. They have all walked out from Vaishali, and as they arrive, they each offer their parasol to the Buddha and lay them at his feet. Bhante tells us in his commentary on the text in The Inconceivable Emancipation that the parasols represent spiritual aspiration. And here, as in the poem, the dreams are offered and laid at the feet. I have spread my dreams under your feet. What the Buddha does is to magically transform the dreams, the aspirations, the parasols, into a single precious canopy so great that it formed a covering for this entire billion-world galaxy. So what the Buddha does is to make their dreams, their aspirations, into the cloths of heaven. This vision was and still is one of the most defining inspirations of my involvement in the movement. It was what captivated me and got me walking from Vaishali, figuratively speaking, carrying my aspirant parasol in the company of other young people, men and women, also carrying their parasols high. I felt intensely moved and proud to be part of that company. I was inspired by the possibility of all our parasols becoming a single precious canopy. So I offered my parasol to the order and joined in building the Buddhaland here and now. I threw myself into making the vision become a reality. Women's community, evolution shop, mitra convening, and finally chair of the centre. Then one day something happened. I looked around and found I'd become separated from all the others. They were all over there, and inexplicably I wasn't over there with them. And then when I looked up at my parasol and took a closer look, it somehow seemed to not be up to scratch. In fact, I realised it wasn't the beautiful, exuberant parasol I had thought it to be. Instead, it was rather jaded and rickety, and not really something you'd want to put on display. So I rather shamefacedly rolled it up and retreated back on my own to Vaishali, figuratively speaking, where I have been most of the last 10 years. I know I'm not alone in having that kind of experience, though mine has probably lasted a bit longer than most. But I'm sure most, if not all of us, will have had moments, or even perhaps more than just moments, of disappointment, even disillusionment, at the challenges we can face when practicing with others. What we face in our own individual practice can be challenging enough. But when we're also trying to co-create something so significant and on which our dreams depend as well, the stakes are very high. In this talk, I'm going to use my own experience of living our collective life to explore two particular themes. One is, how does things going wrong, either personally or collectively, fit into our vision of the Buddhaland? And the other is to look at what our relationship is now to the bodhisattva who initiated our Buddhaland, our resident bodhisattva, Bhante. I've always understood that in setting up the movement and the order, Bhante's intention was to create the conditions for a pure land, a Buddhaland. Bhante, the more experienced bodhisattva, communicating the vision, and we, the aspiring bodhisattvas, all practicing together to bring the vision into existence. And I've always understood that what we aspire to is to be a vessel within which the bodhicitta could arise. Bhante explains the miracle of the vast canopy formed from the joining together of the 500 parasols as symbolizing the cosmic bodhicitta, the arising of the cosmic bodhicitta. And in the text of the Vimalakirti Nirdesa is a description of what can be seen and heard as you look up into that canopy. The vastness of the entire billion-world galaxy, with limitless suns, moons and stars, limitless heavenly realms, along with a detail right down to the rivers and the wee burns and villages. And we don't just see it geographically, we also see it psychologically and emotionally. The text tells us that we see the realms of all the different dimensions, including the devas, the yakshas, the four great kings, and down to the voices of limitless Buddhas teaching the Dharma. As I understand it, the significance of the canopy is that it reflects back to us, to all living beings, our world, the vastness, the beauty, the infinite possibility of our universe, of our individual lives. But most significantly, as we see ourselves reflected back to ourselves by the canopy, we hear the voices of all the Buddhas of the 10 directions, proclaiming their teachings of the Dharma in all of the worlds, the sounds reverberating in the space beneath the great precious canopy. So it seems to me that the function of the canopy is to reflect back the full extraordinary scope of our world, and also to catch and bounce back the sound of the Dharma, of the Buddhas teaching the Dharma. So to me that seems to fit what the order has been engaged with over the last 50 years, at least to some extent, and perhaps in rather a patchy way. I think on the whole you'd agree that our attempt at the canopy has not yet perhaps been able to reflect back the full vastness of the universe and of the Dharma. But we have caught something of a reflection of the true potential of being alive, and we have allowed the voices of the Buddhas to be heard to some extent, and in doing that we have made it possible for at least some people to understand and touch a greater significance and purpose in their lives. I've been reflecting on what this experience of being in the order, being in an aspiring Buddhaland is like, and trying to find a way of describing it from the inside. My sense is that through giving us each Dharma names, Bhante has made that vision of the vast canopy a bit more something that we could almost touch into as an ongoing possibility, a lived reality. It's like Bhante sung us and our Buddhaland into existence through giving us Dharma names. Hearing the sound of the Dharma resonating through our names is like looking up into that canopy. Through our names we recognise each other as forming the warp and the weave of the canopy. We feel how we interlink and how we support the vision between us. And I think that is because our commitment to each other is given shape in this way through our names. That our commitment to the bodhisattva vows is made obvious. Relieving the suffering of the world is an endless task, but relating to each other gives us an immediate sense of what we are engaged with. Somehow our collective interlinking reflects us back to ourselves, and we see the billion-world galaxy in the shape both of what is possible to bring into being and how we can make that happen. At our best, in tiny moments, our sensitivity and connection with each other is like those great gatherings of birds in the sky, those great murmurations of starlings swooping and turning and enfolding with lightning speed and awesome sensitivity. How do they know to all change direction now and swirling there and there and there? It seems to me that our collective practice is the medium and the means for our commitment to the bodhisattva vow to express itself. It's like the collective is our currency with which we affect the world. It's like our collective practice is a magnetic field. That's why joining the order is such a big deal, and why leaving the order is such a big thing to do also. But sometimes, as we know, some aspiring bodhisattvas do draw back. They begin, as I did, to feel out of sync with the murmuration of the order, not just on the odd occasion, but more and more. Some get so deeply troubled that they actually leave this aspiring Buddhaland. I'm sure we can remember the names between us of those who were part of the Scottish Sangha: Uttara, Manjuprabha, Shubhamati, Nagaraja. And then there are those who haven't resigned, who still keep in some kind of contact, but for who, for whatever reason, and at least for the time being, don't share their practice with us collectively. All of them, in joining the order, or in opening themselves to the vision of the order, laid their dreams at our feet, and for that I personally feel grateful, for all that they contributed and for their courage in sharing their dreams. So how can it be that we can see the Buddhaland so differently from when we first got involved? How is it that we can have such different experiences of it from each other? And where do things going wrong in our experience of the Buddhaland fit in the overall vision? Fortunately for us, a little further on in chapter 1 of Vimalakirti Nirdesa, we find Sariputra struggling with a troubling thought very similar to the dilemma I've just described. The Buddha has been responding to Ratnakara's question, how do we set about building the Buddhaland? With a detailed and beautiful teaching, he finishes on a lofty and inspiring note. The purity of the Bodhisattva's Buddha field reflects the purity of living beings. The purity of the living beings reflects the purity of the Bodhisattva's knowledge. The purity of his knowledge reflects the purity of his doctrine. The purity of his doctrine reflects the purity of his transcendental practice. And the purity of his transcendental practice reflects the purity of his mind. It's then that Sariputra has the disturbing thought, which goes along the lines of, if the Buddhaland is only as pure as the bodhisattva who brings it into being, then the Buddha must have not been very pure when he set this one up. Look at the state of it. Looks like a pile of shit to me. The Buddha responds by suggesting two possibilities for why someone might see the Buddhaland as impure. Either that their ignorance, their spiritual immaturity causes them to see it that way, or that the Buddha has made it look that way in order to help living beings grow and develop. As a helpful God points out to Sariputra, in case he hasn't picked up the full import of what the Buddha is meaning, the fact that you, Sariputra, see such a Buddha field as this, as if it was so impure, is a sure sign that there are highs and lows in your mind, and that your positive thought in regard to the Buddha knowledge is not pure either. Unlike me, and possibly you, Sariputra doesn't appear to take any offence from the God's well-meaning clarification. But to help him out, the next minute the Buddha presses his toe to the earth and just for a minute or two miraculously shows everyone present what the true nature of the universe is, a mass of sparkling jewels. And everyone, including Sariputra, sees themselves seated on a throne of jeweled lotus.
Go on.
And you also. I haven't actually ever had the experience of seeing the world as a mass of sparkling jewels, but I know that others here do, and have at times seen the world transfigured and more real than what we normally call real. And there will be others of us who have a different way of experiencing vision, which may not be visual. The vision that I had when I was first getting involved, which so inspired me to want to help build the Buddhaland, was the possibility of true open communication, deep open-hearted connection with myself and others. But, as some of you know, to your cost, that is not something I found at all easy or was really any good at all. So perhaps that's why I confess I have quite a lot of experience of looking at our Buddhaland in the way Sariputra does. So I thought I would look back at my own experience of rolling up my parasol and retreating back to Vaishali to see how helpful the Buddha's analysis on why I was seeing things as impure. I took the vision of the 500 parasols combining to form the vast canopy covering the heavens as my ideal. I understood this to mean that I needed to practice self-transcendence, the necessity of going beyond myself for the benefit of others or to look after the needs of the situation. Looking back, I can see that I had a very crude and inaccurate notion of how to do that. But I didn't know that I didn't know. In other words, I thought I knew. It seemed obvious to me that it meant putting myself last and to not pay attention to what I really wanted or felt or thought. I was just trying to hold the situation and respond somehow. So now I can look back and think, yeah, that was spiritually immature by the Buddha's definition, because now I know that listening to my deepest intuition, my deepest sense of honesty and integrity, is how I go beyond my limited self. In Dharmic language, I have a growing appreciation for how investigating the contents of my mind and heart ongoingly and rigorously means that I am able to master my mind rather than let my mind master me. Sometimes in those years I had clear moments of realization that I was doing myself damage, although I didn't give any time to reflecting in what way or how. But I comforted or reassured myself that if I looked like I was going off the rails, my friends would alert me. They would be looking out for me and covering my back. They would warn me if they could see signs that I was losing touch with the real quality of the refuges. However, when the crunch came, it became obvious to me at any rate, that my friends hadn't told me, and it seemed like I was the last to know. It was almost shattering to discover that the intuition that I had been damaging myself was true, and that others had noticed. And it seemed to me that I had been left to carry on the damage. Surely I could have been told earlier. I felt betrayed. But of course, my friends didn't know what my unspoken assumption was. I hadn't told them. I was relying on them to keep me right, because I hadn't been practicing open-hearted communication. And as I journeyed further and further away from myself, I can imagine it would have been harder and harder to let me know that I was becoming ever more difficult to read, seemed to be more interested in getting my own way, and more driven. Obstacles put there in order to mature? Yeah, I think I can see that. What I learnt was that you can never give away responsibility for your own awareness of yourself to someone else. Just because you are offering, even surrendering your parasol to the collective, doesn't mean you can give up your responsibility to be connected with yourself, to be as honest as you possibly can be with yourself. When I realised that, I realised that my friends hadn't betrayed me. I had betrayed myself. I had been treading on, even trashing my own dreams. When things go badly wrong in our spiritual life, we can feel like giving up. I certainly did. It took me a long time to gain any clarity on what had happened and find any meaning within the pain. In the meantime, it was hard not to think that all my aspirations and efforts had gone to waste. I felt my own limitations keenly. Sariputra sees the Buddhaland as a pile of, in the polite way of putting it, as a pile of ordure, but he doesn't seem to feel any aversion. Until the Buddha conjures up the vision of the real nature of the Buddhaland, seeing it as a pile of ordure is for Sariputra just a statement of fact. But it's very hard when you have seen the vision and the vision then fades and seems to be replaced with shit. The despair, the sense of betrayal can feel very deep. The Vimalakirti Nirdesa doesn't, as far as I can see, give us a mythic context for this experience. I think it's because the activity of Vimalakirti as the bodhisattva initiating the Buddhaland, he's so effective in challenging and reprimanding all the beings who he comes across. He demands from them that they don't get stuck in assumptions or wrong views. My experience is that on the whole over the years, and even now, we don't find it easy when someone in the order crashes. I think that whether we are the one who's crashed or we are witnessing somebody else going through it, we can feel that something's gone profoundly wrong, something undharmic, and tend to blame ourselves or the person or the order or everything. It shouldn't have happened. Of course, usually things go wrong on that kind of scale because we have ignored the evidence. We have allowed arrogance or pride to keep us from seeing how things actually are and learning from our mistakes. We have kept ourselves in ignorance. As Sariputra didn't point out, shit stinks, and it can be hard to keep sympathy with each other when this is happening. However, a few months ago, when I reread one of the other myths that is pivotal in the imagination of the order, the birth of the 1,000 Armed Alalokitesvara, it gave me a new understanding of the spiritual significance of things going wrong. I, like you, knew the story very well. Once upon a time, the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara made a great vow that he would deliver all the people of Tibet from suffering and help them all to gain enlightenment. He goes further than that. He swears that he will strive selflessly to keep his vow, and makes a wish that should it happen that he ever hesitates in this commitment, his body will split into 1,000 pieces. He aims to lead all beings to enlightenment through subtle means, so he sits down to meditate on compassion. He enters a profound level of samadhi and remains there for a very, very long time. And when he finally emerges from the meditation, he looks around him. And what does he see? He sees that he's not made any difference whatsoever. He hasn't even helped 1/100th of the people of Tibet, which I suspect means he hasn't helped any at all. When he realizes this, he becomes totally dispirited. He thinks, what is the point? He has slammed at full speed into his own limitations. And the next thing is, he thinks, I might as well give up. Well, that is what you think in those kinds of situations. But he had made that solemn wish. Be careful what you wish for. And the next minute his head and body shatter into pieces. Avalokitesvara doesn't physically die from this shattering, which points out to us we're not dealing on the physical dimension, but on the emotional, psychological and spiritual dimensions. On those levels, Avalokitesvara is in total agony. So what does he do? He calls out to Amitabha. And Amitabha comes to him and does something very extraordinary. From the shattered fragments of Avalokitesvara's body, he fashions a new body with 10 heads and 1,000 arms and hands, and he sets his own head on top. And in doing this, Amitabha gives Avalokitesvara the capability to carry on his work of dispelling suffering much more effectively than before. So what struck me was how crucially important the shattering was. I had given all the emphasis in the story to, and Amitabha comes and fashions a new body with 1,000 arms and 10 heads. But I suddenly saw that it was because Avalokitesvara had shattered out of despair that the 1,000 arms had come into being. No despair, no 1,000 arms. And that despair was really not pretty. Shattering into 1,000 pieces on any level is messy. It's raw. It's painful. It feels like the end. It is the end. Or it was the end of Avalokitesvara as he knew himself up till then. We know that Avalokitesvara was naive about his capabilities, because otherwise he wouldn't have smashed into his limitations. I think not just naive but arrogant in how he made his vows. Because of course you can't lead anyone to enlightenment unless they want to. It's not about him in that way. So it shows us that though he was a bodhisattva at that point, he was more of a bodhisattva in training. Quite far along the way, has to be said. However, what we see is that though still in training, he has committed himself so deeply that when he encounters just for a moment his own despair and feeling of uselessness, it cracks him open. It's his commitment, his dedication, which pulls him apart. And then something else happens, because Avalokitesvara calls out to Amitabha. In his agony and confusion and perhaps fear, he calls for help. He's in bits and he asks for help. He is totally vulnerable, with no guarantee of any help being available. And who does he call on for help? The Buddha of love. I imagine that we're being told that Amitabha both comes as a force from outside of Avalokitesvara, and also that Avalokitesvara himself is allowing his heart to open, to feel the keenness of the pain, of the heartbreak. In other words, we're being told that Avalokitesvara is bringing awareness infused with love to the pain that he is going through, and allowing himself to feel it fully through the love, not closing down or denying or trying to pull himself together or blaming others or blaming himself, none of that. Feeling it with an open heart. The blood-red love of Amitabha. And we know that through that blood-red love of Amitabha, the shattered fragments of Avalokitesvara's body are fashioned anew. Amitabha fashions him anew. Amitabha is not put off by the mess and the rawness or the stink. He lovingly handles each shattered fragment of Avalokitesvara's being and somehow infuses each with new life, new purpose and sensitivity to all the different forms and levels of suffering. When I read the story again, I recognised in my own experience and on a much, much lower level the truth of the experience that was being communicated. Although for me a similar process on a much lower level has taken 10 years and counting, instead of the blink of an eye, which is how the myth tells it, human beings need to do things in real time, and that can take a while. It also seemed to me that it was not just significant for us individually, as we crash and burn either publicly or privately. I thought it was also significant and relevant for us as a collective, as we look back over our experience of the last 50 years. Bhante has always encouraged us, inspired us to see ourselves mythically as the 1,000-armed Avalokitesvara, a collective, a murmuration, throwing in our lot with each other, pooling our resources, becoming more than the sum of our parts in order to take on the impossible, to stem the tide of suffering in our world with our 1,000 arms. But I think we can concentrate on the 1,000 arms and not quite take in what it takes for the 1,000 arms to develop. So I thought I would look at the history of our order in the light of the myth of Avalokitesvara. First of all, we have the bodhisattva making a great vow, and then swearing that he will strive selflessly, to keep his vow to lead all beings to enlightenment and out of the grip of suffering. And if that's not enough, he adds an extra twist, that if he falters, he'll be smashed into 1,000 pieces. So to me, this is a bit like our order in our earlier days, in some respects. Perhaps even like us now sometimes. The vision, the excitement, the sincerity of intention, the naivety, the arrogance. I can remember the swagger we had amongst us 25, 30 years ago. We were right, everybody else was wrong. And the overblown idealism. I don't think any of us ever made a wish out loud that if we faltered in our commitment, we would be smashed in 1,000 pieces. But I think if I'd done that at that time, I would have had something boastful in my tone. That's how we were, with our youthful bravado and hubris. And there was also something very genuine, very true, very generous, very courageous as well. If there hadn't been, we wouldn't be here today to celebrate. And then we have the dedication to practice, which particularly shows itself through our building of institutions actually all over the world, or in lots of places in the world, in the UK, in Scotland, and perhaps most importantly in creating our links with each other, the warp and the weave of the canopy. And we show our dedication and our devotion in different ways. There are those of us who out of devotion always just show up and muck in, or who can be relied upon to shoulder responsibility. There are those of us who give money, sometimes their life savings, There are those of us who give talents and time instead of securing some means to provide for their own future security. There are those of us who so often have an inspiring angle and understanding on what Dharma practice is about. There are those of us who struggle and think we are a failure, not a proper order member, but who despite that keep on turning up. And then we have the looking around and seeing that we are not having as much effect as we had expected. We were going to lead all beings, especially Scottish beings, away from suffering and towards enlightenment. And then we get an inkling that perhaps it's not just because the world is unreceptive, but perhaps something to do with our own blind spots and false assumptions. And that horrible sinking feeling of, perhaps we're just not up to the job. I think that these moments have happened on and off through the last 20 years of our history, since the Guardian article, but most obviously and intensely in the last 18 months. And I know that the accompanying questioning and even turmoil has sometimes felt to us like there was something going wrong. That in the despair that shook the order, we were in danger of giving up what was most spiritually vital, that we were giving up on what was most spiritually vital to the world. I don't think that. I think the myth of Avalokitesvara tells us that even if our initial commitment was diluted with naivety and self-aggrandizement, in simply making that commitment at some point, we will hit the barriers of despair. Because when we truly acknowledge and admit our own limitations, that can feel like we're shattering. That's why we find it so hard to do. We instinctively know it's going to shatter us. But as soon as we do acknowledge our part and go through what feels like will be the end of us, then what we find is that we're opened up. We've allowed our guard to drop and shatter, and we stop hardening ourselves against attack. We allow ourselves to feel vulnerability. Being vulnerable means we can then receive. Receiving, which is so much harder than giving. Because when we allow ourselves to receive, we are no longer in charge, no longer in control. So how I see the questioning and pain of our recent past is that it's a sign of our spiritual vitality if we let it be. And that is quite a big if. Because, as we've seen, it's hard to do. It's much easier to blame or to ignore so we can keep the shattering at bay. But if we do allow ourselves to feel our limitations, our vulnerability, and if we call for help, then the myth tells us that Amitabha responds, love responds, the universe responds. Our capacity, our capability to respond to the cries of the world is increased and deepened in ways that we could never have possibly even imagined before the smash. Our tears allow us to grow arms of far greater sensitivity and capability. And it seems to me that in the career of a bodhisattva, or an aspiring bodhisattva, or a murmuration of aspiring bodhisattvas, who are together purifying a Buddhaland, it seems to me that this cracking open, this falling apart, will happen again and again and again. But this time, the cracking open of the order happened because our bodhisattva confessed. Bhante wrote a personal statement. Next year, he was writing last year, of course, next year we shall be celebrating the 50th anniversary of FWBO Triratna. It will be an occasion of rejoicing, thankfulness for the three jewels, and rededication to the ideals for which Triratna stands. For me, as the founder of Triratna, the occasion will be an especially poignant one. I have more than once said I was not the best person to found a new Buddhist movement, but the only one that was available. And friends have sometimes assured themselves and others that my words were not to be taken literally, but were only a sign of my humility. But this is not the case. At the time, I meant them to be taken literally, and I still mean them to be taken literally. I, being its founder, Triratna sometimes bears the mark not of the Dharma, but of my own particular personality. That personality is a complex one, and in certain respects I did not act in accordance with what my position in the movement demanded, or even as a true Buddhist. I am thinking in particular of the times when I have hurt, harmed, or upset fellow Buddhists, whether within Triratna or out of it. These thoughts have borne all the more upon me in the course of the last week, when I was in hospital with pneumonia, as I was well aware pneumonia can be fatal to a man of my age. And I knew that I could die, even though I did not feel that I was dying, despite being very ill. I would therefore like to express my deep regret for all the occasions on which I have hurt, harmed, or upset fellow Buddhists, and ask for their forgiveness. My experience is that Bhante, as our teacher, as founder of the order, from the richness of his spiritual and human experience, has shown us the cloths of heaven. More than that, he offered us the cloths of heaven. That's what brought us all here. And he knows that in response, we have spread our dreams at his feet. For me, as the founder of Triratna, the occasion will be an especially poignant one. For him to confess in this way is a weighty and pivotal moment in our relationship with him and with each other. A pivotal moment in the development of our shared Buddhaland. I think Bhante's confession makes clear something about our community which hadn't been explicit before. If the Buddha field is pure only to the extent that the mind of the bodhisattva is pure, then when Shakyamuni Buddha was engaged in the career of the bodhisattva, his mind must have been impure. Otherwise, how could this Buddha field appear to be so impure? Sariputra, if you remember, had this concern when he heard the Buddha's description of a Buddhaland. My response to Bhante's confession was to feel like a great weight had been taken off me. I wrote and told him that reading his letter had felt a little like how in the sutras people describe reaching insight. I wasn't reaching insight. But I felt like something had been set upright again, or that suddenly a light was being shone in the darkness. To me it felt like he had set something upright again, shone a light into what was dark and confusing through his honesty and humility. I, for one, was able to start to make sense of aspects of my experience over my years in this Buddhaland in a way that had always previously eluded me. As I see it, you might not agree with me, but as I see it, Bhante's confession made it clear to me that our Buddhaland had been impure to some extent, over and above the impurities caused by our own individual failings and immaturity. I don't think that in saying this or admitting this I'm diminishing or denying Bante's bodhisattva activity. If Avalokitesvara can feel the full force of his limitations, why not Bante? And I'm not wanting to diminish or deny the spiritual potency of our Buddha field. It's more that I think in Bante making the confession and us receiving it, there is the potential for the nature of our relationship with Bante to change and mature, and therefore for the spiritual potency of our Buddhaland to become more effective. I don't know how it was for you, but I had got more used to the feeling of, but after I got more used to the feeling of relief from reading the letter, I started to then feel challenged. I felt awkward. I felt uncomfortable about being asked to forgive him. It was all the wrong way round. He was the teacher, I was a student. I was supposed to confess to him. I had to let it all sink in. I found it easy enough to accept his expression of regret, but I realised he was asking for more. He was asking for forgiveness. I think over the years I tended to put Bante into a category of somehow being beyond serious fault. It was a bit like looking at the sun. I could kind of see it, but it was too blurry from too much light. He was over there on a different level. On the other hand, if it seemed to me that Bante had done something unskillful, I would get very angry and accuse him, at least in my own mind, of being a fraud. I think my problem was that I was assuming that when someone has allowed themselves to be a channel for the transcendental, that somehow they are no longer operating on the karmic level as well. I think in making the confession he was showing us something above and beyond the bare bones of the confession. He was teaching us that although you can open yourself up to become a channel for the transcendental, you can also act unskillfully, and that he was taking that unskillful action seriously. So I felt I needed to take it seriously too. My observation is that we can think that Bante, and perhaps others more senior to us, have done so much for us that it is mean-minded to find fault. Where would we be without them? We want to excuse out of gratitude and loyalty. But over the last few years I've changed my mind about this. Now I think that if someone has touched the cloths of heaven, felt the impact of the transcendental, even to some extent, they are more likely to be aligned with truth, with honesty in and about themselves. Because of that, they will be more resilient to hearing difficult things about themselves. So any difficulty in raising things with them must be coming from me. And given how uncomfortable I felt about being asked to forgive Bante, I realised that there was in me at least a need to preserve the status quo. The status quo of him being the one in charge. How else to explain my willingness to find fault, but my awkwardness around dealing with when fault was admitted? Gradually I realised that if I was to respond to Bante's request for forgiveness, I would need to take more responsibility in my relationship to him. Taking more responsibility meant I felt more able to meet him in what he was asking, at the depth from which he was asking. I think that it is through meeting Bante at that depth that our relationship with him as a community matures. And I realised that I did have something that I needed to be able to forgive Bante for. Although Bante has never hurt, harmed or upset me personally, I realised that I felt harmed as a member of this community, this murmuration of order members, by the consequences of his unskillful actions. I realised this through reflecting on that experience of relief, of feeling a great weight coming off my shoulders on reading his confession. The relief was primarily because something that could not be spoken about, or only spoken about in a particular way, could now be spoken out loud. What a relief. To have anything in a community, especially a spiritual community, that could only be talked about in a certain way, or was hard to bring up at all, is bound to cause trouble in the long run. In a certain sense, I think the problem was not so much what Bhante did when he acted out of accordance with his position in the movement. Although, of course, that was serious enough, at least for some. It was more that due to his position in the movement, we didn't, or we struggled to know how to talk about it. I think when he says he didn't always act in accordance with what his position in the movement demanded, and that Triratna sometimes bears the mark not of the Dharma but of my own particular personality, he is saying that he wasn't always able to live out the consequences of allowing himself to become a channel for those non-egoic forces. In making himself available to the transcendental, he was agreeing to make a sacrifice. The sacrifice was to give up his freedom to act just as an individual according to his own preferences and conditioning. And we know that his actions have always had a different significance among us. As I understand it, in committing himself to set up the movement, he gave up his free path to anonymity, so that whatever he said, whatever he did, had a global and magnified significance on the Buddhaland he initiated. We were always going to take our lead from him, including if he acted from his preferences and conditioning. Of course, any negative consequences that he had on the life and spiritual health of the order were unconscious and unintentional. Of course, what he did in becoming a channel for the transcendental was an act of staggering generosity and courage. Of course, it is completely understandable that he wasn't always able to make that sacrifice, but as he has made plain, his negative actions still have had an effect. And of course, we also need to look at and take responsibility for how we responded to Bhante's negative effect. I certainly have needed to. Some of us learnt to live with the ambiguity that could be seen in Bhante's behaviour and managed to stay connected with their own integrity. I, for one, didn't manage it. And in the time after I rolled up my parasol and retreated back to Vaishali, I became uncomfortably aware of how, in an effort to square the circle in regard to Bhante, I had closed down a door of awareness in the back of my mind. And that this had an effect on my own ethical sensitivity and also how I responded to others in the order. I became aware of how I had colluded with the silence, not consciously, not intentionally, but it still had had its effect on me and on others, and I realised that part of my legacy was to have passed on that silence, that deflection, that closing down in the back of my mind. I have felt called to account about this over the last year, and at times I have felt great shame. As it mounted up in me, I could feel it purifying me. I knew it was free. The first time I felt it, I was in the shrine room here during an Order Mitra event last September, where we had been talking about the controversial aspects of our history. During the puja afterwards, as I sat, hot with the Hri, Bhante's poem, The Four Gifts, was read out by Viryadevi. And the thought occurred to me that this shame, this Hri, was Bhante's fifth gift to me, to all of us. Did we dare receive it? So I'm going to leave us with that question. Do we dare receive it? All of it. The vision and the shit. The dedication and the despair. The inspiration and the heartbreak, the love and the shame. I teeter on the edge. I let myself receive it enough to write this talk and to be here today. But I can also feel a huge no in me. It's too unbearable, because these moments of shattering, they don't just happen in the big dramas of our bust-ups with each other or with how we're doing things. They also happen in the quiet, in our inner processing, those moments where we just hit up against our own limitation, our own sense of, no, I can't go any further than that. So at the moment, I've been feeling I can't quite let myself shatter. It's been like this for weeks. Remembering the poem helps. Had I the heavens embroidered cloths, enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths. Under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you